Hello and welcome back to part 2 of your English Literature poetry lessons covering Remains by Simon Armitage. Today's learning question is, what should I do when first reading a poem? And what we're going to do today is talk about the kind of questions that we might ask ourselves when we first read the poem, the kind of things we might look out for as we go through it. And as I said in the last video, this is not only useful for getting to know the poem Remains, it's useful for getting to know any poem that you come to study in the future. So make sure you've got your notepad, your pen, highlighters, copy of the poem Remains, and we'll be ready to start. We'll begin with some key vocabulary for today's lesson. Structure. This is the arrangement, where they're put, and relationship, how they go together, of the parts of a larger whole. So the structure of this wall is multiple bricks stacked in specific ways to create that. The structure of this poem is it's split into 4 parts, 4 stanzas, quatrains, 3 quatrains there, each one 4 lines, and the rhyme scheme, for example, they're part of the structure, A, B, A, B. When we look at a poem, we can think about the structure there. Dramatic monologue, I mentioned this in the last video, but here's a clear definition for you. A poem in the form of a speech by a single character in which they reveal their inner thoughts, feelings, and character, sometimes without meaning to. And that can be important because then the poet can show us even more about a character who might be a very unpleasant person but not realize it, and that can add an extra level of depth. And what it allows the poet to do is to explore the inside of a character's mind. So while they're here on their own, monologuing, giving their speech, we are looking inside their brain and seeing how they really feel, and they are revealing things to themselves. And this allows the poet to really explore an emotional state. In this case, of course, Simon Armitage looking at trauma and grief and guilt. So we're going to use both of those today, thinking about the fact that this is a dramatic monologue and thinking about the structure of the poem itself. And we're going to answer a series of questions that will help us form our first impressions. And that's really going to take up most of the activity that you do here. So the questions are roughly broken up into 2 boxes. On the left-hand side, we have the effect of the language and the narrative of the story. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at the structure of the poem itself. So let's understand the questions before we read the poem, and that way, when we read the poem, we'll be keyed up and ready to actually find the answers. So what mood and atmosphere do I pick up from the language? How is this poem, how does it feel? How does it make me personally feel? And that can be different. You could read a depressing poem, but come out of it feeling happy because you are not in the situation that that character in the poem was going through. You might read a happy poem and come out of it angry. So these two can be different. And what lines do stand out to you as well? So what makes you imagine something very vividly? What language grabbed your attention? What made you stop and think, oh, hang on, what does that mean? What lines stand out to you? Pick a maximum of 3 and make a note of those. When we look at the poem structure, think about how many stanzas, that's verses. We'll be referring to the stanzas from this point on. Is this poem broken into? What's different about the final stanza? So a bit of structure here. The poet has chosen to write something different about the final stanza. What is it? And how does that create a negative ending? So think about that. The poem is in 2 parts, and there is a specific and noticeable part of the poem where it switches from one part to the other, between the killing in Iraq and the effects on the soldier's life. Find that line and write it down. How does that particular line show he didn't expect to be so affected by what happened? How do we see that kind of that pause, that change, that moment where he goes, actually, no, this isn't right? Now, the poem, the structure of the poem, uses a lot of short sentences in the first half, describing the killing. Why do you think that is? Think about how short sentences affect the mood, atmosphere, and pace of a piece of writing. And why might Armitage, the poet, be using that here? And the final 7 lines of the poem, you will notice they're one long run-on sentence. They describe how the memory of the killing stays with him. Why did Simon Armitage do that? What does it tell us about the soldier's mind? The fact that this runs on over 7 lines. how does that affect our understanding and allow us to see inside that soldier's mind and experience his emotions? Now, looking at the poem itself, which is what I'm going to be doing next, I try to speak the poem in my own mind in the way that I imagine the character would. I try to give myself an almost dramatic reading of the poem, and it really does help, because when you start to read it as if it is a character speaking that out loud, then you're forced to think about, well, how would I say this part, and will I try to act it out? So when I read through this poem, I'll try to think about how the soldier must have felt at that time, and I will try to read that in that way. I'm going to read through the poem now, and you can do that with me, and after that you'll be able to answer these questions. On another occasion, we got sent out to tackle looters raiding a bank, and one of them legs it up the road, probably armed, possibly not. Well, myself and somebody else are all of the same mind, so all three of us open fire. Three of a kind all let him fly, and I swear I see every round as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight on the other side. So we've hit this looter a dozen times, and he's there on the ground, sort of inside out, pain itself, image of agony. One of my mates goes by and tosses his guts back into his body, and he's carted off in the back of a lorry. End of story, except not really. His blood shadow stays on the street, and out on patrol I walk right over it week after week. Then I'm home on leave. But I blink and he bursts again through the doors of the bank. Sleep, and he's probably armed and possibly not. Dream, and he's torn apart by a dozen rounds. And the drink and the drugs won't flush him out. He's here in my head when I close my eyes, dug in behind enemy lines, not left for dead in some distant, sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, or 6 feet under in desert sand, but near to the knuckle, here and now. His bloody life in my bloody hands. So we've had the reading of the poem, and now it's time to answer the questions, and hopefully you have got some ideas already in your mind here. So each of these questions needs to be answered on paper. You can either write out the question and then the answer, or you can answer in full sentences. The choice is yours. However, it helps you to organise that on the page. Just don't write out only the answers, because then they won't make sense in the future when you read them back to yourself. You've got 10 minutes to do this activity, and when this activity is finished, then you have completed the second video on remains. So you can stop there and move on to video 3 as soon as you're ready. Keep these notes together, of course, because you'll be using these in subsequent videos to help you to answer more complicated questions as we go along. So you can get on with that task right now, and I will see you in video 3. Thank you.